right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm Dale, the Real Seeker, and today we're going to be continuing on with our my Shroud solo series, and moving on to the next ordinary naturalistic mechanism that purports to explain the formation of the images on the Shroud of Turin, both the body images and the bloodstain images. Now, just before we get into that, a couple of RSM announcements. So for the month of March, it's actually going to be a jam-packed month. At least as it looks on paper so far. Who knows if there'll be cancellations or delays that come up. But just to give you guys an idea of some of the guests that I have lined up. So obviously the next show I will have next week will be with Dr. Egel German. That he's got his new ministry up and running. I'm scheduled to record with him in a couple days on Wednesday, March 3rd. And I'll be posting it up after that. So we'll be discussing everything, why he's a Christian, why he believes in God, what his new ministry is all about, answering some Jewish objections to Jesus, as that's his main focus. The following week is going to be a busy one. So I have a show set up with David Kemble Cook, who is a biblical Unitarian who recently lost his faith. He's still a general theist, but he no longer believes in the Bible or Jesus or anything like that. And we're going to be specifically focusing on the problem of evil, both the general problem of evil, how it applies to general theism, and then looking at it from a biblical perspective. Well, does the Bible provide an adequate answer to the problem of evil or not? And how do we deal with certain ethical issues in the Bible? How does it relate to salvation? So yeah, my good buddy David Russell will be joining me, and both of us together will be kind of having a discussion on the problem of evil with David Kemble Cook, and hopefully we can convince him that maybe he's got some things wrong on that front and bring him a little bit closer to coming back to Christ. And also it's not confirmed yet, but I am in the works. I do have an agreement in principle with a young Christian apologist who's very, very smart. In fact, he's going to be debating T-Jump, from my understanding, this Saturday, on March 5th, on the ontological argument. But yeah, this guy is, I loved his videos. I looked at it. Democracy of the Dead is the name of his YouTube channel. But yeah, he's got great stuff. So we're working out dates and times. So far, we're hoping for Saturday, March 12th. But we'll see if the timing works out to bring him on the show and discuss something with him about the philosophy of religion and that sort of thing. And also I reached out to the Muslim listeners, Chewy and you guys. I did reach out to the Muslim metaphysician to see if I can bring him on to discuss something related to Islam. I haven't heard back from him yet, but even if I don't, I will definitely go over some of the videos in that great playlist that you gave, and I will respond, do kind of a review show, a respectful one, not a polemical one like I do with the SNS skeptics, but a review of some of his arguments or how he treats some of the stuff in that playlist, just out of respect, as a gesture to you that, hey, I did go over his videos and seriously consider what he has to say. And I think that he's a serious scholar. He's taking it seriously, so he needs to be someone that you treat respectfully and engage with. So I have a plan to do that for you guys at some point. Maybe that'll be in April, depending on the scheduling. In late March, I'm supposed to have Dr. Asha Lancaster Thomas come on to speak on both pantheism and the evil God challenge. She's an atheist philosopher, just graduated from the University of Birmingham, and she's an expert in the evil God challenge specifically. So that's my area that I'm writing my thesis on, and she was very helpful to me, so I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, I'll cut it off there. That's it. There are a couple other guests I have later on in mind. But yeah, that's the plan so far. So you can see we're jam-packed. We've got a lot of things going on. We'll see what works out, what doesn't, what gets postponed and stuff like that. But so far, that's the plan. All right, cool. So with that said, let's get straight into this Shroud solo show. All right, so the first thing I want to do before I get into the new mechanism on the gas diffusion or gas evaporation naturalistic mechanisms, I just wanted to follow up on my last show regarding the direct contact hypothesis, and specifically I laid out some of my arguments, mechanistic type arguments, why I think the formation of the bloodstains are extraordinary. And in the course of explaining that, I mentioned one hypothesis by Mark Antonacci in the historically consistent hypothesis, which is the one I favor. Again, we'll get into more details in that in future shows when we get to those extraordinary type mechanisms. But I mentioned how, Mark Antonacci briefly he thinks that the bloodstains supernaturally or extraordinarily were disappeared by an act of God and then were deposited onto the cloth through an extraordinary mechanism. In that femtosecond, when Jesus' body disappeared from the Shroud of Turin during his time of resurrection, the bloodstains also disappeared and reappeared on the shroud, and then subsequently the body images formed later on. But Bob Rucker is another pro-shroud expert and a friend of mine. He was kind enough to kind of reach out to me and gave a different perspective. He said, well, hey, you're forgetting about my mechanism and that sort of thing. And again, I wasn't trying to be thorough in that show. I was just mentioning one extraordinary mechanism as a for example. But I want to, out of respect for Bob's work, I want to just read what his comment is regarding that bloodstain issue that I was talking about. Here's what Bob says. So, quote unquote, I just watched episode 13 on the direct contact mechanisms to get the blood onto the cloth. You considered 3 mechanisms: painting, which is an ordinary naturalistic one, direct contact between the body and the cloth, again an ordinary naturalistic one, and then a hybrid option. In each case, you proved that option could not be the truth. In considering the contact option, you pointed out there would have been some air gaps between the body and the cloth. This means the blood must have been transported across the air gaps between the body and the cloth. There is another option that should be considered, though. This is a vertically collimated radiation burst, or a VCRB, from within the body. If brief enough and intense enough, we know naturalistically and scientifically that this will thrust the blood, whether wet or dry, off the body and across the air gap by a natural process called radiation pressure. The blood will be thrust off the body onto the cloth exactly vertically, both vertically up and vertically down, in terms of the dorsal side's bloodstain images. If the radiation burst is vertical and primarily particles such as neutrons, protons, and electrons, this VCRB hypothesis will thus explain the image formation, carbon dating, and how the blood got onto the cloth, as discussed in Bob Rucker's paper, paper number 32 on his website, on the research page of his website, which is www.shroudresearch.net. And I'll include that link as well as the link to that paper on my blog site for you guys. Finishing off, it is a powerful argument when one concept, VCRB, this vertically collimated radiation burst mechanism, can explain all 3 mysteries of the shroud. Please communicate to me using my email, and my best to you. I don't know if he wants me reading out his email or not. I think it's on his website, so it should be fine, but just in case, I won't read it. But yeah, if it's available on his website, go, he's always there to help people. So all right, cool. So that's what Bob Rucker's hypothesis is here. And it's interesting because he's saying, well, look, this is a ordinary naturalistic process. This radiation pressure, this is another mechanism that you, Dale, in your direct contact show totally failed to mention. You didn't bring this up or assess this, but this would naturalistically explain how the blood stains in those non-contact areas, or what Bob Rucker's calling those air gaps, would have pushed out or pulsed out after a radiation pulse onto the shroud. They didn't have to disappear from the body and then reappear on the shroud as the historically consistent hypothesis of Mark Antonacci and that I advocate for happened. And he's absolutely right. However, I disagreed. So Bob, I think, is trying to say, well, look, we don't even need to appeal to the supernatural to explain the bloodstains. We have a naturalistic process. And I think he's right. This vertically collimated radiation pressure is fully ordinary naturalistic mechanism that we know about. However, I would still classify Bob Rucker's hypothesis here as it's still an extraordinary mechanism. And the reason because it's the initiating event that causes, radiation pulse from within the body, or radiation burst, as Bob Rucker calls it. That's still a quote-unquote supernatural, or at the very least an extraordinary event. Even if the laws of nature take over and explain how the bloodstains flew across, took over after that initial supernatural or extraordinary event inputted by God during a femtosecond of the resurrection of Christ, and then the laws of nature took over and responded accordingly. It's the exact same as saying, like, the virgin birth. Well, the initial conception, that was an extraordinary or supernatural event, if you want to say supernatural. But if you're catering to the skeptics, fine. Whether supernatural, natural, who cares? It was an extraordinary event whereby God, it was a God-designed event. God did that initial fertilization of Mary at the conception of Jesus, and then the laws of nature took over, and she had a normal, 9-month process, and then gave birth or normally and stuff like that. Well, it's the same thing here. There is that initial extraordinary femtosecond, as Bob Rucker likes to say, where that radiation burst pulses out, and God designs the event where Jesus rises from the dead, and then the laws of nature take over. And sure, yes, the laws of nature tell us about radiation pressure, and this could explain how the bloodstains were pulsed up onto the cloth and downward vertically onto the dorsal side of the Shroud of Turin. Fully agree, yep. And it's incredible. Bob Rucker's right that, well, look, with his one hypothesis, he can explain the three mysteries of the Shroud all at once. And this is an argument, perhaps, when we get to the radiation hypotheses, this might be in favor of it. It's Occam's razor, the simplest explanation. He can explain more things with one hypothesis or one mechanism, relative to Mark Antonacci, who requires two separate mechanisms, one for the body images, one for the bloodstains, something like that. But again, that's well beyond the scope of my direct contact hypothesis. My main aim was to refute ordinary naturalistic. Whether you take Bob Rucker's or Mark Antonacci's notion of how the bloodstains formed, I would still classify these as extraordinary mechanisms. Again, regardless of whether you think they're supernatural or natural, either way, they are God-designed events. At the very least, with that initial phase, it couldn't have happened by ordinary naturalistic means, meaning well-established, currently well-known laws of nature or natural mechanisms as are well-established today. No, God had to input and either use the laws of nature in a way that's not extraordinary, or you inputted what I believe a supernatural mechanism to deliver that initial event, and then the laws of nature took over. So that's all I'll say on that. I will get into more detail once we start looking at some of the extraordinary radiation hypotheses in future shows. But I just wanted to read out Bob's comment there, because it's important to note that, look, even on the extraordinary end, there are multiple hypotheses to try and explain how the bloodstains were formed by God and the laws of nature working together. But my point still stands that Bob fully agrees with me. Look, what I'm calling ordinary naturalistic mechanisms, through direct contact or painting or a hybrid, they cannot explain how the Shroud's bloodstain images were formed due to the reasons I cited. So that point remains. Both Bob and I agree, regardless of any differences in mechanisms that we might have on the extraordinary end, we still agree that the ordinary naturalistic mechanisms, utter failure. They don't work. All right, cool. So that's it on that. I just wanted to clear that up. So let's move on. Let's get straight into the gas diffusion models, this next ordinary naturalistic mechanism. So great, we found out direct contact between the body and the cloth can't get the job done. It utterly fails. It can't explain the body images nor the bloodstain images. So now we need to provide a little bit of nuance. Let's find out the next hypothesis, what I'm calling gas diffusion or gas evaporation mechanisms or hypotheses. Okay, so as we saw, direct contact has certain limitations, inherent limitations, such as it can't produce full body images because there wouldn't be contact between all parts of the body, and otherwise. Also all parts of the body in the cloth, sorry. And also the vertically mapped wrapping distortions. Well, direct contact, you have to press the cloth down to touch those non-contact zones. You get distortion effects, wraparound, horizontal, lateral distortion effects all over the place. So it's just scientifically impossible for direct contact alone to explain them. Some of these minimal relevant features that we've been talking about. Well, this is where gas diffusion comes in, because essentially the gas diffusion hypothesis is a combination. It utilizes both direct contact and gas diffusion together to explain some of the images. And obviously, just off the top of your head, you can picture gas can travel through the air, for example, so the non-contact zones wouldn't be a problem, and that sort of thing. So you can kind of see why gas diffusion is a step up from just pure direct contact. And over the years, there have been various proponents of various types of gas diffusion models. The two most prominent that I'm going to focus on here is one of the earliest, Paul Vignon, who has what's called the Vapograph theory, and more recently, the famous Stirp scientist who's done the best with this type, Dr. Ray Rogers, and he proposed what's called a Maillard Reaction Hypothesis. And it was this one, Gary Habermas said that this is probably the best of all the gas diffusion mechanisms. We'll get into why later. Barry Schwartz also believes, at least as of a few years ago when I last talked to him about this over the phone, he mentioned that he thinks that the Maillard reaction at least plays a partial role in explaining the formation of the Shroud's body images. It has limitations. It can't explain all of the minimal relevant features on its own, but he thinks it's at least part of the explanation. Okay, so let's look at each of these two mechanisms, the two most prominent gas diffusion mechanisms. Let's start with the vapograph theory made by Paul Vignon. So it was first suggested by him in 1902, and then kind of formalized in the year 1937. You'll remember when we discussed Paul Vignon in our direct contact hypothesis, he was also flirting with the idea of direct contact in the early 1900s, 1902. And then by 1937, he published a paper in Scientific American, I think it was, where he totally discredited that. And he went instead with this vapograph theory as the best explanation. Paul Vignon, it's important to remember, he's one of the earliest scientists to take a serious interest in studying the Shroud of Turin. Remember, it was both him and Yves Delage, the agnostic medical forensic expert, who led the first international scientific or forensic presentation of the various medical and anatomical accuracies visible on the Shroud Man from the photographic negative at the French Academy of Sciences from 1900 to 1902. He wrote his first book on the Shroud in 1902 and then subsequently published another article on his findings in the prestigious peer-reviewed academic journal Scientific American in 1937. So I was right, Scientific American there. And it was in this article that Vignon advocated for his vapograph hypothesis as a possible explanation for the Shroud images. Now, it's important to remember, 1937, we have to take it easy on this guy because he's posting this prior to the Stirp investigation in 1978. So he's totally clueless and ignorant of all the minimal relevant features about the Shroud. It's three-dimensionality, it's vertically mapped wrapping distortion, it's distortions, it's superficiality. All of that stuff, Paul Vignon doesn't have a clue exist on the Shroud's images. He just knows about the photographic negativity and that it's amazingly accurate, anatomically and forensically accurate in terms of its body and bloodstain images. So we have to bear that in mind and be charitable towards him when we're assessing his theory. He didn't have all the scientific facts that we have post 1978 and today. But anyways, yeah, so this was his vapograph theory. It was proposed as one of the first ordinary naturalistic hypotheses. And remember the difference. Ordinary naturalistic just means, look, a body, human body or dead body, and the laws of nature alone. Well-established ordinary laws of nature or ordinary natural mechanisms alone create the Shroud's body and bloodstain images. Ordinary artistic requires that plus some kind of artistic input or artistic design by a human artist. And then extraordinary mechanisms are designed by God. It requires a divine input or a divine intelligent design. Okay, so what did he say? Well, basically he said, look, to explain how the striking images revealed by Secondo Pia's photographic negative images were formed, he proposed that a dead body was covered in perspiration and sweat from his pre-death torture and crucifixion. Then he was wrapped in the shroud and laid in a tomb. The urea contained in his sweat then fermented into carbon dioxide and ammonia gas. And it's the latter of which, the ammonia gas, that is what it was being postulated to diffuse or evaporate onto the cloth as a gas vapor, thereby causing the body images and that sort of thing. Now, since the cloth would have also have been soaked with some kind of embalming mixture, he supposed, probably containing what the Gospels say, like aloes or olive oil or myrrhs or something like that, it would obviously, these chemicals would react with the ammonia gas and become stained, so that yellow images of the shroud's body images are a stain from this chemical reaction between the ammonia gas and also these embalming substances that were posited to be there, assumed to be there. In terms of the blood marks, obviously Paul Vignon, the blood stains can't be the result of gas diffusion in any way. So obviously, there's no way to transmit blood through open air unless, remember Bob Rucker, but that's an extraordinary mechanism. There's no way to transfer it through the open air with an ordinary naturalistic mechanism, and that's what we're assessing here. So yeah, obviously he had to go with the direct contact approach for the body, for the bloodstain images, and we saw in part 13 last time that those don't work. Direct contact alone can't explain how the bloodstain images and all their features, or minimal relevant features as we're calling them, became encoded onto the cloth. So right away we can tell that it's going to be an utter failure here, just with the bloodstains alone. But anyways, that's his theory. So we're talking about what he said. So yeah, again, sweaty body, the urea contained in his sweat produced various carbon dioxide and ammonia gas. The ammonia gas interacted with some of the embalming mixtures on the shroud, and this yellowed or stained the cloth, thereby creating the body images that we see today. So that's Paul Vignon's Vapograph theory. Let's look at the more modern update, the Maillard Reaction theory by STURP scientist Dr. Ray Rogers. Barry Schwartz, best friends with Ray Rogers for years before he died. And he really looks up to Ray Rogers. This is someone that, world-famous chemist that we need to take seriously. And he investigated the shroud firsthand. He was the one who gave Dr. Walter McCrone his samples and that sort of thing. So he was coming up with this Maillard reaction theory in and around 2002 and between 2003 and 2005 before he died, right before he died. So that's when the Maillard Reaction Hypothesis was made. So let's find out what this is about. Okay, so again, who is Ray Rogers? Well, he was the official director of chemical research for this STURP, or Shroud of Turin research project, back in 1978. The head honcho. This is, again, we got it. This is one of our pro-Shroud guys. So Rogers is basically famous for suggesting that the Maillard reaction was a possible body image forming mechanism on the Shroud of Turin. And despite Ray Rogers dying, unfortunately, or passing away in 2005, his work continues to be recognized by many as authoritative in Shroud research today. As I said, Barry's very partial to him. Even Gary even disagrees with Rogers, but acknowledges his work in terms of this Maillard reaction. So yeah, many Shroud experts do think that his proposed mechanism provides the best shot, at least in part, at being able to explain the Shroud's images strictly in accordance with ordinary natural laws and mechanisms, at least that have been advanced to date. What is Ray Rogers' theory then? It's important we consider this. And essentially, Rogers' proposal in a nutshell is that, look, during the manufacturing process of the linen shroud, a very thin contamination layer of carbohydrates, either of starch or of sugars, emerged on the entire surface of the linen cloth on the Shroud of Turin. And then, obviously, Jesus died and was crucified, and he was placed, his dead corpse was placed in the Shroud of Turin, and as the corpse decomposed or putrefied, it gave off amino acids in a gas diffusion process, so evaporated as gas vapor process, And this consequently reacted chemically with the surface layer of the starch on the cloth, and hence there was a caramelization process or an effect that produced the kind of yellow to light brown color that we associate with the body images on the Shroud of Turin today. And this caramelization effect, caramelization, caramels, the color of caramel candies, that it's the caramelization effect that we refer to as a known chemical reaction, an ordinary naturalistic chemical reaction known as the quote-unquote Maillard reaction. So that's his hypothesis in a nutshell. Great. So yeah, like I said, that kind of lays out what we're looking at here in terms of these two proposals. Why don't we get into it in terms of assessing each of them in the light of all of our minimal relevant features and see how they perform. Okay, so in terms of minimal relevant feature number one, there are about three aspects here. So in the first place, in terms of the photographic negativity or the counter feature quasi-negativity, both of these mechanisms can readily account for that aspect or that feature of the Shroud's images. Additionally, gas diffusion methods can account for the image diffuseness of the image. Remember, it has no definable boundaries to the naked eye, and you can only see it from a certain distance. When you get up close, it becomes diffuse and you can't see it at all. Gas diffusion mechanisms can readily account for that. Now, here's the problem. Let's first take a look at in terms of the Shroud's high resolution data. Remember, and it's been quantitatively proven here to an actual precise quantity as to how the high resolution operates, how highly resolved the Shroudman's body images are, especially in the facial area. So looking at Paul Vignon's Vapograph theory, utter failure. In the first place, the credible STURP scientists actually did scientific experiments to prove, and they falsified that this mechanism is even possible. It's not even possible that this mechanism could work. And they discovered that it's inevitably blurry. You don't get highly resolved images like we have with the Shroud of Turin. And the reason for this blurry nature of the images, they discovered this scientifically. The reason for this is whenever gas diffusion is the mechanism at play, well, the diffusing gases or vapors spread in all directions, right? You've heard Brownian motion from young Earth creationists and stuff. Well, they're absolutely right. Gases spread in all directions equally. It was also empirically discovered that they're greatly disturbed by even the smallest of convection currents. So this in turn can greatly alter the vapor's path to the cloth. And this issue is especially problematic with the high frequency components like the facial images, very highly resolved. And you can check the sources. I forget what the actual numbers are on that. Again, it's been scientifically proven. But it's just impossible. Vapors diffusing out in all directions just will not create the high resolution images, especially the Shroudman's facial images, but let alone, forget that, even the worst, the least highly resolved images on the Shroudman, impossible to obtain with the Vapograph hypothesis. Diffusive spreading just will inevitably produce distorted images. Okay, well, what about Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction? How does this fare? Well, believe it or not, it's the same problem. It doesn't fare much better in its ability to produce high-resolution images. So essentially, this technique by Ray Rogers theorizes the use of heavier-than-air gases. And as such, the bodily orifices, like the mouth and lips, the areas between the legs and in between the cheeks of the butt, would all be expected to saturate the cloth. And that would cause it to become very densely colored in those areas. So in the words of some credible pro-Shroud experts, quote-unquote, the body will keep producing amines, I don't know how to pronounce that, whatever, potentially increasing over some period of time for the entire body, leading to saturation of the image area in such a way as to homogenize the intensity structure, thus degrading the resolution and any subtle differences in cloth body distances. So that's what it just would not produce the high resolution. And in that quote, you You can see there are several other problems when we get to further minimal relevant features as well, where it just utterly fails. But yeah, with the Shroud, the separations between the legs and the cheeks of the butt, on terms of the Shroud's dorsal images, are clearly resolved. The lips of the Shroud man, for crying out loud, they're the smallest or least resolved images in terms of the Shroud's body images. Even these are highly resolved compared to what's produced in a Maillard reaction, like Ray Rogers would suggest here. Now, it's important to note here, I was talking to my friend, who's pro-shroud expert Barry Schwartz, who's, again, was best friends, really good friends with Dr. Ray Rogers himself, and he told me in a private communication that Rogers has already tackled this objection, so he has a response to this objection in terms of the lack of high-resolution images. What Rogers says is that, he says, well, due to the coolness of the environment in the empty tomb, there would be no convection currents. And instead, the gases wouldn't be distorted by these. The gases instead would just linger wherever they were, without moving, and that would prevent the blurring effects and stuff like that. And then obviously the gases would slowly stain or turn the images in color, stain them yellow to light brown over the course of 36 hours or so. However, it has to be said, I personally don't buy this explanation. It's, number one, it's very ad hoc. There's no proof that these conditions would work. And even if they did, they're very highly fine-tuned conditions that I don't think we can say, because remember, even the smallest of convection current will totally distort it. But even if we grant this explanation about the coolness of the tomb and no convection currents, again, gases diffuse in all directions equally. We wouldn't get the definable boundaries, the definable body images and facial images that we see to the same level of high resolution given a Maillard reaction alone. And I think when I get to lower other features below, even Barry Schwartz admitted that, again, this is kind of something where you need another mechanism in combination with a Maillard reaction to kind of direct the gases. What that might be, well, we'll get to that in future things when we look at certain electrostatic explanations. People like Daniel Spicer and E.T. Totten have a hypothesis, an electrostatic hypothesis that can kind of direct the gases or guide them to create focused or high-resolution images. So they say, but that's a future mechanism. We'll get to that. At this point, we're just looking at Ray Rogers all by its lonesome. And I don't think, even Barry kind of admits that it wouldn't produce the highly resolved images on their own, even if we grant Ray Rogers' kind of rebuttal here about, well, maybe the temperature was so cool that there were no convection currents, and therefore that would mitigate against or reduce the amount of blurring that we should expect. I'm not sure that even that works. At least it may mitigate it, sure, but it won't reproduce the high resolution images. So yeah, my assessment here is that none of the various proponents of gas diffusion models have ever produced any experimental evidence that such a mechanism, whether obtained with heavier than air gases or otherwise. Paul Vignon, for example, I think has lighter than air gases or that sort of thing. But even whether you have heavier than air or lighter than air gases, the high resolution seen on the Shroud of Turin simply cannot be obtained. Instead, all of the published scientific experimental data published on both sides, it all points to the same thing and points to the contrary conclusion. Quote unquote, the diffusion process seems capable of encoding body shape and cloth drape information into image structure, but only in the low frequency part of the spatial Fourier spectrum. So high frequency components like the Shroud man's face, necessary to define facial details, are simply not generated owing to diffusive spreading. Since this is not the case with the Shroud image, we must reject the pure diffusion hypothesis altogether. So that's a quote from some of the world's experts. Again, we've done extensive, thorough scientific experiments, and these mechanisms on their own can't do it. They can't produce the highly resolved images that we see with the Shroud, and that's even the case. Even if we grant that Ray Rogers' retort about the temperature in the tomb and trying to mitigate against convection currents and trying to say, well, it wouldn't be as distorted as people think if this was the case. Well, it would still be distorted enough so that it wouldn't be reproducing the shroud. Therefore, it's impossible. These gas diffusion methods, very, very improbable, if not, I would say impossible, that they can account for the highly resolved images of the shroud man that we have. All right, cool. So let's move on to the second minimal relevant feature, body image uniformity. What do we say about that? Okay, so in terms of body image uniformity, the first aspect is the uniform intensity of color. And on this front, I have to admit, in my research, I wasn't able to find credible scientific results or details about this aspect in particular. Maybe that's just my feeling, I suck at research or something like that. But because I was unable to find information either way on this front, I just left it as a not applicable status on my spreadsheet for this theory in terms of these theories in terms of accounting for this aspect. So maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I personally don't know, so I can't give you an informed opinion either way. I just wasn't able to find any credible data on either side based on my studies. Okay, but there's the second aspect, and I was able to find info on this. So this is the body image uniform density. So it's both the dorsal and frontal images are as dark as each other. One's not darker than the other. There's a possible exception with the facial image, but that's outside of this. But they have these uniform maximal densities on both the dorsal and frontal image. Now, believe it or not, so Paul Vignon's theory, utter failure. It cannot account for these uniform densities, but Ray Rogers' theory can. The Maillard reaction can account for these body image uniform density. The reason is, well, it all depends on whether you postulate the body being removed from the shroud before a sufficient quantity of decomposition or putrefaction liquids builds up and forms on the shroud. In Paul Vignon's Vapograph Hypothesis, he didn't do that. He didn't know. He was before STIRP, so he didn't know he had to do that. But yeah, he said, no, the body just stays there and decomposes. That would create much darker images, or it wouldn't have a uniform density of color. Ray Rogers, on the other hand, he was this credible STIRP scientist, the head chemist of the project, so he knew what he had to get. So he posits, well, look, the body must have been removed very quickly before these decomposition liquids had time to build up, where the density of color would be an issue. So yes, green check mark for Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction on the body image uniformity, red X for Paul Vignon's Vapograph on that front. Now, in terms of cylindrical uniformity, remember, doesn't qualify as a minimal relevant feature. The color is uniform intensity all around the 360 degrees of each fibril, but that's not a minimal relevant feature. But I'll just to inform you, if we someday confirm that this is a fact beyond all reasonable doubt, or where all experts agree, both these mechanisms would fail to account for that. No gas diffusion model, Maillard reaction or Paul Vignon's Vapograph or any other gas diffusion model, would be able to account for the cylindrical uniformity of color around each fibril. Again, that's not a minimal relevant feature, so I can't use that against these theories, but just be aware of that for your own information. Finally, we have the fourth aspect, and this applies. It's substance uniformity. So remember, at the minimum, there's at least two substances here, because gas diffusion models or hypotheses posit a human body. So there's hair that's encoded on the shroud, and there's human skin, two different substances. And this gas diffusion mechanism has to work uniformly on both substances in order to encode that onto the shroud. Well, how do these gas diffusion hypotheses fare on that front? Well, I estimated it's questionable. It's questionable for me how a gas diffusion mechanism could operate uniformly on both skin and hair, and equally to encode the corresponding images onto the shroud in the uniform way that we see it, uniform intensity and uniform density of color. I don't know, just my gut reaction is that seems improbable, but I was generous to the Shroud skeptics, and I gave it a questionable status, a yellow question mark, on my Excel file. Granted, obviously hair could have come into contact with the sweat, through contact with the body. But again, hair itself doesn't perspire. There's a question here. It's suspect as to whether all of the hair would become sufficiently encoded with sweat to an equal degree to the skin so that both would be encoded with the same intensity of color and the same densities of color and that sort of thing on each individual fibril. I don't know. I think that's very improbable. I think it's improbable. It should be a red X. This should be a failure. But I'm so generous to the Shroud skeptic. I'll give you a questionable status here. I won't hold this against the gas diffusion theories. So yeah, that's where I stand on body image uniformity. So not as quite as clear cut as we thought. Okay, what about the third minimal relevant feature, the body image three-dimensionality, or the topographic information? So utter failure for any and all gas diffusion mechanisms, scientifically impossible for any and all gas diffusion mechanisms to account for the Shroud's three-dimensional body images. Again, remember, what is it that makes up the quote-unquote 3D information, or the topographic information encoded on the Shroud of Turin? Well, it's differences in the density of the image being correlated to body-to-cloth distance. So in other words, the lightness or darkness of the body images correlates precisely to the distances between the body and the cloth. And don't forget with this, as an aside, body image uniformity, uniform intensity of color. It's not like individual fibrils are colored more dark or light than others. No, they're all equally uniformly colored. But it's the concentration, the number of colored fibrils in one area versus another that makes the images darker or lighter. So this is incredible. Gas diffusion mechanisms, utter failure. They simply have no way scientifically, given the laws of nature and physics, to convey or encode this kind of 3D information or topographical information, because this mechanism inherently causes image saturation, meaning the image becomes as dark as it possibly can be. It's saturated with the color. And if that were to happen, once the image is saturated, well, then there'd be no corresponding different three-dimensional data. There wouldn't be lightness or darknesses that correspond to three-dimensional images. It'd all just be flat if it was all saturated. In all of the saturated areas, there wouldn't be any 3D info. They'd all just be flat. And again, remember, this has been scientifically verified through rigorous experiments by the world's experts. Every single attempt to reproduce this feature of the Shroud using any and all gas diffusion models, including the Maillard reaction, including the Vapograph theory, obviously that was the oldest one, all of them have resulted in highly distorted images, and that includes the fullest set of experiments conducted by the credible STERP scientists, Dr. John Jackson, Eric Jumper, and Bill Erkeline, who proved conclusively, 0% doubt, or if you're go with Allen and his science, 99.99% proven, there's a 0.01% doubt that all gas diffusion produced images would create highly distorted, non-three-dimensional images, at best with little bits of different variations in color or something like that, or variations in topographic information. It wouldn't be correlated to the exact and precise mathematically calculated distance between a body and a cloth. Impossible. And what's more, again, this has been empirically proven through scientific experiments. And remember, gas diffusion mechanisms are highly sensitive, very much disturbed by convection currents. If there was even the smallest convection currents, that would greatly alter any and all vapors' paths to the overlying cloth. Once again, you would get this totally blurry image lacking high resolution, but not only that, it would be impossible for it to encode three-dimensional or topographic information precisely correlated to the body cloth distances of the body underneath the cloth or on top of the cloth in terms of the dorsal image, let alone the facial images that have high frequency variations on the Fourier spectrum. Impossible. Yeah, obviously remember Rogers, he tries to say, well, maybe if there's no convection currents, even still, impossible based on the scientific experiments. Gas diffusion inherently is just not able to encode this kind of information, it depends upon image saturation in order to work, at the very least in certain areas. And this would totally distort, ruin, and destroy the complete three-dimensional, perfect three-dimensional images, with the exception of some distortions. On the Shroud of Turin, there are some distortions in the 3D image we have, in particular where blood stains are there, and that kind of throws things off a little bit because the blood stains aren't three-dimensional. Other than that, it's perfect, spot on. That's impossible with gas diffusion. You wouldn't get that. You know, this spot-on body-to-cloth distance correlation. Can't happen. Not only can't it happen theoretically, but we've done the rigorous dozens and dozens of scientific experiments. It doesn't happen. It's a scientifically proven fact. They don't work, my friend. Give it up. All right, cool. So that's what I wanted to say about this. I would say it's a scientific impossibility. Again, utter failure for both the Maillard reaction with Ray Rogers and for the Vapograph theory. And this is, again, speaking of these gas diffusion in isolation. So it might be a different story if we combine that with another ordinary naturalistic mechanism, such as I hinted at with the electrostatic things. We'll have to assess that when we get to those theories. But just looking at gas diffusion in isolation, no other mechanisms helping it out, utter failure. It doesn't translate this 3D information. All right, so let's move on to minimal relevant feature number 4. So obviously with those vertically mapped wrapping distortions, our first aspect on this minimal relevant feature, or MRF for short, it's scientifically impossible to produce. To have gas diffuses in all directions equally, at least when operating on its own merit. This is inherent to gas diffusion and how it works through the laws of nature and physics. So it inherently lacks the ability to produce high-resolution images that can be evaluated to conform to the Shroud's orthographic effect, where it's just vertically encoded in a straight line or perhaps through a curvy linear line. Impossible. We just wouldn't get that. So this is scientifically falsified. Gas diffusion on its own just doesn't work. Again, though, bear in mind my friend ProShred expert Barry Schwartz, who says, but this is in terms of gas diffusion models in isolation. It might be able to account for these vertically mapped wrapping distortions, or this orthographic or rectilinear or curvilinear encodation path straight vertically to the cloth. If we posit perhaps the addition of a vertical electrical field of some kind that can rectify and it guides the gas, it would focus the gas to encode only in paths that are vertically aligned or something like that. But that's outside of the gas diffusion hypotheses proper, right? That's positing an additional combination mechanism to work with it. We're not there yet. We'll get to that when we get to those electrostatic hypotheses, but I'm wanting to make you aware that there is that aspect that we need to get to when we assess different theories in the future. For right now, though, gas diffusion by itself, impossible for it to encode these vertically mapped wrapping distortions, and even ProShred experts that are partial to Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction admit this shortcoming of the theory, that it can't account for this on its own. Okay, what about the next aspect of this feature? So remember, there are, on the Shroud of Turin, no body side images or the top of the head has been encoded, being consistent with this vertically aligned mapping process. The sides of the body weren't laterally encoded on the Shroud. Neither was the top of the head, which wouldn't have been aligned vertically with respect to the Shroud of Turin as the man lay down in a supine position there. Well, unfortunately, gas diffusion mechanisms don't account for this lack of body side or top of the man's head images, because we would expect it to encode all of the body images. I mean, the body sides would have been covered in sweat too, right? They wouldn't have been just non-sweaty. It was just his top just precisely the vertically aligned portions of his body that had sweat on it. The rest of it was bone dry. Come on now, Shroud skeptic, come on. That's just ridiculous. So yeah, no, I'm sorry. The body side images would have all been sweaty, and the same gases would emerge not only from the front and dorsal parts of the man's body, but equally from the sides as well, and therefore we would have body sides being encoded on the Shroud if the gas diffusion mechanisms were at play. Paul Vignon's Vapograph Hypothesis, utter failure. It just can't explain no body side images at all. What about Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction? Well, yes and no. So in the first place, no, if the shroud was wrapped around the body. But Ray Rogers is smarter than that. So Ray Rogers has actually tried to address this issue by proposing, well, maybe the sides of the shroud were propped away from the body, and that's why the sides of the body didn't get encoded. So he posits maybe those spice bundles or flowers were used to prop the shroud cloth up and away from the sides of the body, and that's why they failed to become encoded on the shroud, in the same way as the frontal and dorsal images of the shroud man's body weren't. They were in contact with the shroud or in close proximity to it, and therefore the gas reacted with the shroud only on those areas, but not in terms of the body side. Well, as to this possibility, in the first place, it is plausible. We have to admit this. Historically, this could have happened, and yes, it would explain why there's no body sides there. However, I find it improbable as a complete explanation, because it wouldn't be perfect. It wouldn't be pristine to have mathematically proven vertically mapped wrapping distortions. Maybe part of a cloth would be touching his body side, part of his body sides. We would get partial body side images, or maybe the bundles of spices would leave, we wouldn't get full frontal or dorsal images. Part of the front or the dorsal image wouldn't be close enough to the cloth because of these spice packs. So the fact that they get it precisely on is very ad hoc. I don't find that to be very convincing, or at least it's something that needs to be addressed or is just assumed by skeptics. So let me read what the credible STURP scientists have concluded regarding this kind of possibility about the sides being propped away from the shroud, and that's why the body sides weren't encoded. Well, quote unquote, it has been proposed as a corollary to Rogers' hypothesis that the reason there are no side images is that the shroud was not wrapped around the body, but rather was held up and thus kept away from the underlying body by spice packs and flowers that were packed around the body perimeter. This might offer some explanation of why no side images are found on the frontal body image, but not for the dorsal image. Oops. For the dorsal image, the heavier than air ammonines, remember Ray Rogers posits heavier than air gas, so it just kind of lingers there. It doesn't spread out and float into the atmosphere like lighter than air gases do. And this was proposed by Rogers, would tend to saturate the cloth. They wouldn't float away into the atmosphere. They would stay there and saturate the cloth, utterly make it as dark as it possibly could be. And this would, quote unquote, causing there to be colored fibers in the area out and away from the body, and in the area between the legs and the cheeks of the shroud man's buttocks or butt. This is not observed on the Shroud of Turin. Utter failure. Rogers' attempt here was a good one. It, at least at face value, seems to explain why there's no body side images encoded. But actually, no, we wouldn't get what we find with the Shroud of Turin, where it's this perfect frontal and dorsal only. The dorsal image would not produce what we get with the Shroud of Turin. There would be saturation, and that would cause there to be colored fibers out and away from the body proper, at least on the dorsal images, and in between the legs and the cheeks of his butt. That's not what we have with the Shroud of Turin. So utter failure on that front. And remember, you don't get out of this problem by positing lighter than air gas, because that raises other difficulties and that sort of thing. Obviously, Ray Rogers has to posit heavier than air gas for specific reasons to avoid other problems that came up when proponents of gas diffusion proposed lighter than air gas in terms of the diffusion of that gas and that sort of thing. And obviously that gas would float away with the air and diffuse out and could presumably travel further and encode itself on the shroud, even if they were up and erased away from the body or something like that. However, in terms of the other aspects, so there's full-length body images. Obviously, gas diffusion mechanisms can account for that, right? It's possible that what about the non-contact zones? Remember, there's various areas of the body, as well as blood stains, where the body is encoded, but a naturally draped cloth wouldn't be touching it, especially if you've got the sides propped up. It's not wrapped around and tied around his body. Well, if that's the case, as Ray Rogers postulates, well, non-contact zones could be encoded, right? Gas would evaporate from the body and they would diffuse into empty space onto the cloth. So yeah, hypothetically, it could account for those two aspects of this feature. However, it is important to note no scientific experiments have tried to use this method, given Ray Rogers' postulations here, to try and encode full-length body images. Rogers himself, he only ever attempted to reproduce parts of a body image, not the full thing. So there's a question mark there, but nonetheless, we'll give it to the Shroud skeptics. So there's 4 aspects with minimal relevant feature number 4, in terms of the non-contact zones on the body images and the full-length body images on both the front and back, or dorsal images. Green check marks for the Shroud skeptics. The gas diffusion models can do it. Although there is that element of questionability because there's no experimental verification that it would work in this way that Rogers proposes. But let's give it to them. The last 2 ones, in terms of the no body side images, impossible. It would fail even if we use Ray Rogers' postulation that somehow the shroud wasn't wrapped around the body. The sides were propped away from the sides of the body, preventing encodation. We would still have issues, at the very least, with the dorsal images. Finally, vertically mapped wrapping distortions, utter failure, scientifically impossible for any and all gas diffusion mechanisms to be able to account for this feature. Even the gas diffusion proponents like Ray Rogers or Barry Schwartz, who likes the Maillard reaction, for example, even they admit this is problematic. It can't explain this feature, at least not on its own, without any additional mechanisms being proposed to help account for it. Great, so that's it in terms of this minimal relevant feature. Moving on to minimal relevant feature number 5, body image superficiality. Oh boy, as you guys could probably tell already, massive issues in accounting for gas diffusion models or mechanisms to account for this feature. Let's get into it. Okay, so focusing on Paul Vignon's vapograph theory first. So obviously, the superficiality of the Shroud's body images was a discovery that was yet to be made in 1937. He didn't have a clue about it. He was ignorant, of course, and clueless. Why? Because Stirp took place in 1978, well after he was dead and gone. So he didn't know about this. But obviously, this finding instantly disproved and scientifically falsified. 100%, you're a fool if you still believe in this theory, given body image superficiality. It's a modus tollens, denying the consequent straightforward argument. This is what the principle of scientific falsification is all about. So yeah, Paul Vignon's vapograph theory, again, it posited a lighter than air ammoniac gas, ammonia, right? And that would have penetrated deep through the threads of the shred of Turin. Wouldn't have just been on the top 2 to 3 fibrils of each thread. The image color wouldn't have just been on the primary cell wall of each individual thing. And in fact, even on the fabric level, it would have penetrated all the way through the cloth and showed up on the backside. Yeah, it's just scientifically impossible for the body image superficiality to be true if Paul Vignon's vapograph hypothesis is correct and we posit some kind of lighter than air gas or vapor to be responsible for coloring or staining the Shroud of Turin and creating the body images. Scientifically impossible. But in addition, likewise, since the body is postulated to decompose over a long period of time under this hypothesis, it gets even worse. There would be a vast amount or a very significant amount of decomposition or putrefaction liquids present on the shroud. And this would cause the other 2 aspects. Remember, the shroud has no cementation of the threads or fibrils at all. They're not stuck together or cemented together in any way. Well, with all these decomposition liquids, we would find evidence of that, guaranteed. Yet we don't have that with the Shroud of Turin. Scientifically proven fact, this hypothesis is falsified on that basis alone. Not to mention the capillary flow. I mean, definitely that would have been detectable on the Shroud's images if this mechanism was responsible for it. It wasn't, therefore it's not. A straightforward modus tollens reasoning. If the vapograph hypothesis is true, the Shroud of Turin's body images would not be superficial, would be cemented and show evidence of detectable evidence of capillary flow. Premise 2, they do not show evidence of capillary flow, and they do not have non-superficiality, or sorry, I'm mixing that. They do not show superficiality. Therefore, they were not caused by the vapograph theory. Logically deductive argument. You're a fool if you deny this. It's gone. You're destroyed. But it's even worse. There's the third aspect to this minimal relevant feature number 5, the non-saturation. The body images are not saturated. I forget the numbers offhand. Again, in part my Shroud solo shows, part 4 and 5, I give the actual quantitative numbers, or you can go to my blog site for those episodes, and I give the list by all the dozens and dozens of Shroud experts, and you can get the actual quantifiable data. But I think the Shroud is only 23% colored. It's 23% plus or minus 5% or so as dark as it possibly could be. It could be 77% darker than what it is, if I'm remembering those numbers correct. It's somewhere in that range. I remember that much. That might just be the face, which is the darkest. But yeah, so there would be massively higher levels of image saturation expected. It would be way darker, especially on the dorsal image, and around the body orifices like the mouth or other areas, other bodily orifices and stuff like that. Definitely, those would be saturated or much, much darker at the very least than what we have. But scientifically, they're not. Scientifically proven fact, utter failure. I'm sorry, Paul Vignon. Take your ball, go home. You lose, you're wrong. We'll be charitable to you because you created this Vapograph hypothesis in 1937 and you had no clue about all this stuff. Ray Rogers, he doesn't have the same excuse. He's in the early 2000s creating his Maillard reaction. So let's see how he does. Ray Rogers uses a heavier than air gas, an amine gas, A-M-I-N-E, however you pronounce that, gas. And that chemically reacted with a pre-existent superficial starch contamination layer on the micro-thin evaporation surface of the Shroud. So the starch contamination layer, that itself was already superficial, according to Ray Rogers. A postulation, no proof. This is just what his hypothesis speculates. And that's why the body images were superficial, because the gas reacted chemically with the already superficial contamination layer of starch and or sugars on the Shroud. It was a micro-thin evaporation surface layer. So assuming he's correct about this starch layer that he's just positing for the sake of argument, then yeah, it is theoretically possible that this hypothesis could account for the body image superficiality feature. Green check mark for Ray Rogers and the Maillard reaction here. Though I do want to just mention a critique about Ray Rogers' take on the body image superficiality of the Shroud of Turin, given his hypothesis, by Shroud skeptic Colin Berry. You'll remember him when we were looking at our Scorch hypotheses, and we'll be doing a future show on his latest scientific results. But yeah, Colin Berry kind of takes Ray Rogers to task here, and he critiques Rogers' theory on the issue of superficiality, particularly based on what he thinks his Rogers' misunderstandings, quote-unquote, of the flax/linen surface onto which the superficial Shroud image was imprinted, whether by natural processes or miraculously or by forgers. He describes the hemicelluloses of linen as a quote-unquote impurity, despite being an intrinsic and major component of the superficial primary cell wall, or PCW, and then substitutes that conjectural man-made impurity coating, which Rogers thinks is the starch or the sugars or the saponines, whatever you posit, onto which the Shroud image was then imprinted. So I'll provide the link for that on my blog if you want to read Colin Berry's critique in a little bit more detail. He has that objection to Ray Rogers' take about this so-called superficial starch layer that was on the Shroud of Turin, and he doesn't think it works. Again, Colin Berry is a Shroud skeptic. Remember, he takes an ordinary artistic mechanism approach for explaining the Shroud's images. So I'm not quoting a Christian, a biased Christian who just wants a miracle here. But yeah, I'll provide the link to his blog about that, and you can read that on its own. For our purposes, I'm trustworthy enough of Dr. Ray Rogers, and trusting Ray Rogers here goes against my hypothesis as a Christian that the Shroud is supernatural and can't be explained through this. So we'll just give him a green check mark. But it's important. Check out Colin Berry, the artistic Shroud skeptic, who says, no, Rogers is out to lunch here. This wouldn't work. He's wrong about this superficial layer. So yeah, just be aware of that. All right, cool. So what about Rogers' hypothesis in terms of non-cementation or no capillary flow being evident on the Shroud of Turin? Well, Rogers' hypothesis says that, look, the body was removed before any significant amounts of decomposition or putrefaction liquids could accumulate onto the cloth. And yeah, that green check mark again, we'll give it to you, Shroud skeptic Ray Rogers. Quote unquote Shroud skeptic. He's usually pro Shroud in other respects, but again, there's a nuance here. But just for simplicity's sake, a Shroud skeptic, we'll call Rogers in this case. But yeah, we'll give it to you. Yeah, so you can explain this feature. So where is it Rogers goes wrong? Well, it's the last aspect of this fifth feature, namely the non-saturation of the image, and that's where Rogers kind of falls off the wagon here. Remember, Rogers posits heavier than air gases, those amine gases, to be at play here. If that's the case, they were at play in terms of the formation of the body images, well then these gases would be expected to fully saturate the cloth, at least at certain body orifice regions, such as between the legs, the mouth and the lips, the nostrils, and the rectum. But yet none of these body image areas have been saturated, as would be evident by a denser coloration in those areas, and that would inevitably lead to a loss of the high resolution and of the Shroud of Turin, as we mentioned before. So yeah, Rogers' theory then fails to account for the non-saturation aspect of our fifth minimal relevant feature, or MRF here. Now, finally, there is one last aspect to this fifth feature. It's not a minimal relevant feature, but it is something you should be aware of, and that's the double superficiality. Remember, we mentioned that in part 4, I think, or part 5 of my solo series, where some scientists like Giulio Fonti says that there's double superficiality with the facial image, for example, that's been discovered. So there's the frontal image, it's superficial on the front of the cloth, but then on the reverse side of the frontal image, there's another superficial image of the face on that as well. So it's double superficiality. Now this hasn't been scientifically verified to the point where I would call it a minimal relevant feature. We can't use this feature to evaluate hypotheses or mechanisms and rule them out, in or out, kind of thing. But nonetheless, just be aware of this feature. And I assigned a questionable status. I think it's questionable as to whether any of these gas diffusion mechanisms, well, put it this way, the ones like Ray Rogers, Maillard reaction along those lines that posit certain types of gases and that sort of thing, I think it's heavier than air gases. I assigned a yellow question point, or in my Excel sheet, or a questionable status. I don't know either way. So just be aware of that. It's not an MRF, so who cares? It doesn't matter whether these theories can account for them or not. But yeah, that's it for the fifth minimal relevant feature in terms of superficiality and the other related aspects. Let's move on to minimal relevant feature number 6, and this has 3 aspects. So the anatomical accuracies, or the condition of the man in the shroud. There's no decomposition or putrefaction liquids in sufficient quantities on the Shroud of Turin. Again, we've already kind of mentioned this, but nonetheless, it's part of this 6th feature proper, so we'll say it again. And then finally, the blood stains and the properties of the blood stains. How does the gas diffusion model handle these? So let's get straight into MRF number 6 here and assess the gas diffusion theories and see how they do. Okay, so let's start with the no decomposition or putrefaction liquids or signs on the Shroud of Turin, since we've already discussed that in prior MRFs and that. So obviously both all gas diffusion models fail this. So obviously with Paul Vignon, we mentioned he doesn't posit the body being removed from the shroud. It just stays there for a long time, whereby the body decays more and more. So obviously it fails. The fact that there haven't been sufficient quantities of decomposition or putrefaction liquids proves that the body must have been removed very quickly from the shroud before such signs would become evident, and the vapograph theory of Paul Vignon doesn't say that, so it fails. But even Ray Rogers' theory, Maillard reaction, he does postulate the removal of the body very quickly before major decomposition can take place. But nevertheless, the fact of the matter is, his gas diffusion inherently involves some form of decomposition. That the very fact that he has to posit decomposition gases for Rogers' theory to work, that is in and of itself evidence for decomposition. And the gas emissions from the bodily orifices in particular, the mouth, the nose, the rectum, these would definitely cause image saturation and other detectable evidences of decomposition or putrefaction in these areas, yet we don't have that with the Shroud of Turin. Interesting. So utter failure for all gas diffusion models cannot account for the fact that there hasn't been sufficient quantities of decomposition or putrefaction detected on the Shroud of Turin. Okay, what about the blood stain or body fluid images? So remember here, gas diffusion theories, obviously gas diffusion can't explain blood. Blood can't transfer as a gas in a liquid state through the air onto a cloth or from a cloth onto things. So obviously gas diffusion theories rely on a combination. They say, well, the blood stains, those were transferred through direct contact, and we already established that. We evaluated either direct contact, that fails in terms of the blood stains, so all gas diffusion models that rely on direct contact fail. Same with painting. If somebody painted the blood stains, that fails. Or if it was a hybrid technique, those fail. So there is no ordinary naturalistic mechanism that one can attach or combine with gas diffusion theories in order to explain the Shroud's blood stains, and we already covered that in detail. I'm not going to get into the reason why all ordinary naturalistic mechanisms fail to encode the Shroud of Turin's blood stains. But if you go to my part 13 show, I do go into exquisite detail on this in terms of the blood stains and explain my reasoning there. So go back to there. I'm going to save time this time around, not get into that. Finally, what about the anatomical accuracies? So here I would say, obviously, because the gas diffuses in all directions, we're not going to get those highly resolved images, and that's going to impact upon the anatomical accuracies. Now, on my Excel sheet, I just gave, because I didn't have any sources that spoke directly on this from credible scientists on either side, I gave it an NA, purple dot, which in my Excel file, which means a not applicable status, meaning I don't rule one way or the other. But let's face it, it's pretty obvious that it would fail these anatomical accuracies just because of the nature of diffusive spreading. You're not going to get highly resolved images, photographic negative or 3D images that correlate to the anatomical accuracies that we see on the Shroud of Turin. So yeah, there's that. So that's it for minimal feature number 6. Not a lot to say there. What about the final minimal relevant feature number 7? These are the additional features. There are various additional features that I laid out in my Shroud solo shows parts 4 and 5. I think it was in part 5 where I lay out all these additional features. We're just going to pick out the additional features that are relevant for the gas diffusion theory here. Now, one thing I forgot just before we move on to the additional features in MRF number 7, with respect to the MRF number 6, no decomposition or putrefaction liquids, I forgot to mention that ProShroud expert, my friend Barry Schwartz, he reminds people when I spoke to him about this, and he says, well, remember, look, there's the no decomposition aspect refers to signs of liquid decomposition and not to decomposition itself, as obviously the gases themselves would be evidence of such, right? So according to Barry, he kind of says, well, look, under specific external circumstances such as humidity or temperature, these aspects might play a role in preventing liquid decomposition from occurring, while at the same time allowing enough decomposition to occur that would allow the gases to be released from the skin pores, the pores of the skin, in order to cause the images on the Shroud of Turin. So Barry Schwartz is kind of countering and saying, well, again, due to certain factors, we might not expect to find the sufficient amount of decomposition or putrefaction liquids. But unfortunately, we already kind of countered this type of scenario, in my opinion, when we address the body image superficiality in minimal relevant feature number 5. Even if we grant this, that the minimal signs of decomposition needed to allow the gases to form the images in the first place might make it unlikely that we would find sufficient liquid decomposition present. Nonetheless, there would still be a saturated amount of liquid decomposition around the bodily orifices that should be detectable. Even if we grant everything Barry says, there would still should be signs around the bodily orifices, around the mouth or rectum and that sort of thing, and that should be still able to be detected by scientists in 1978 or today. And it's not. So it still fails this, but I owe it to Barry. Obviously, just be aware that pro-shroud experts like Barry Schwartz do have a response to this fact, trying to say, well, maybe we wouldn't expect as much, but in my opinion, nonetheless, we would still scientifically expect it, at the very least around the bodily orifices, even if we grant everything, the ideal circumstances in terms of humidity and temperature that Barry would like and that sort of thing. So that's my take on that. So moving on again to MRF number 7, we have additional feature number 6. And this, if you remember from part 5, additional feature number 6 basically says the microchemical evaluation on the Shroud has indicated no evidence of any spices, oils, nor any other biochemical or organic substances known to be produced and or associated with a human body in either life or in death. So remember, this is important because in addition to the lack of sufficient decomposition liquids and or image saturation, there is also no signs of any other biochemical molecules that would be involved in a gas diffusion model. So, for example, remember Paul Vignon in his Vapograph theory, he hypothesized various embalming oils, alloys, myrrh that the Shroud would have been coated in, or the body would have been coated in. For example, Paul Vignon said that the Shroud would have been allotine soaked, for example. But yet all the scientific tests of spectrography, photometry, microscopy, and chemistry all failed to detect any such molecules found on the Shroud in terms of confirming the Vapograph theory. So this is just scientific failure, basically. Paul Vignon's hypothesis wouldn't work. What about Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction? Ray Rogers, he theorized about the use of various biochemicals such as amine gas and possibly ammonia gas as well in his theory. But once again, none of these molecules were detected on the Shroud through all of these various scientific instruments and equipment. Now, obviously, it's theoretically possible to say, those traces could have decomposed, or maybe they oxidized over the centuries, and that's why the instruments didn't detect them in 1978. But again, even if we posit this, it's still very unlikely and improbable that we would find zero trace residues of any of these elements, in terms of being associated with the body images and that sort of thing. So, yeah, the total absence of them in quantities, sufficient quantities in and around the body images, it requires an ad hoc assumption on the part of Shroud experts who advocate for these gas diffusion models in order to explain it away. Why do we have this? Well, they oxidized or decayed over time, and that's why our instruments can't detect anything today. Yeah, but all of it, not even residue traces, that should still be evident on the Shroud's body images if your theory is true about gas diffusion. Nonetheless, I was very generous to the quote-unquote Shroud skeptics. I know it's awkward calling Barry Schwartz a Shroud skeptic or Ray Rogers a Shroud skeptic, but you know what I mean. They're not Christians. They don't believe the Shroud images were formed supernaturally or through extraordinary means where God inputted something into the system. Or in Barry's case, he's at the very least agnostic on that. But yeah, so I was generous to them and I assigned a questionable status for Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction in terms of not finding any of these biochemicals or any biochemical traces around the body images and that sort of thing. So yeah, at this juncture, I think it's important to mention that Rogers' Maillard reaction hypothesis, it also theorizes about the presence of a superficial starch or sugar contamination layer on the shroud cloth itself. Remember, that's what the gases were chemically interacting with to create that caramelization or that yellow to light brown coloring on the shroud. That's known as the Maillard reaction. And as you guys will remember from my minimal relevant features approach, it's not good enough just to select the positive data or minimal relevant features that support my theory in order to avoid any kind of selection bias or cherry-picking fallacy or something like that. We are also looking at any counter features that possibly support the Shroud skeptics against my main argument that God designed the formation of the Shroud images or that sort of thing. And it just so happens when it comes to gas diffusion models, there is an additional feature that serves as a counter feature which might support Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction. What is that? So additional feature or counter factor feature number 9 is that, well, on the Shroud of Turin, it's been scientifically proven to actually find starch or starch impurities on it. What? Just like Ray Rogers said. So yeah, scientists have confirmed that quote-unquote microchemical tests with iodine and pyrolysis mass spectrometry have detected the presence of starch impurities on the surfaces of the linen fibers from the Turin shroud. That's just like what Ray Rogers said in his theory with the Maillard reaction. Is this proof that he was right? Well, let's be honest, at face value, absolutely. This fact is something that could be supportive of Ray Rogers' hypothesis. But we have to note that there's an apparent contradiction among pro-Shroud expert or Shroud experts here, and credible STURP scientists disagree. So in the first place, the credible STURP chemists, Drs. Heller and Adler, they concluded in their investigation after STURP that there were quote-unquote no residual traces of sugar and or starch distributions present on either the body images nor anywhere else on the linen cloth based on their original research. Now, Dr. Ray Rogers came in after the fact. Again, he was a STURP scientist, the head chemist, and he subsequently demonstrated scientifically using microchemical spot tests with aqueous iodine and mass spectrometry that, well, actually, in fact, there is the presence of at least some impure starch fractions on the fibers of the shroud. So these starch impurities. So again, it's not a total contradiction of Heller and Adler. It's a specific nuanced thing that Ray Rogers is saying is on the shroud. So what are we to make of this controversy? Well, we have two general STURP. We have two sets of STURP scientists contradicting each other in terms of their scientific findings. How do we make sense of all of this? Well, in the first place, it has to be said that these starch impurities, traces, were extremely, extremely minuscule, a very, very, very small amount, or trace elements of these. And they were nowhere near the detectable amount that one might expect scientifically had there been an entire starch layer present on the shroud at the time it covered Jesus or whatever, and as gases started diffusing. However, even apart from this, even if we concede that Rogers' starch layer was present on the shroud as he postulated, well then, if it was true, his Maillard reaction hypothesis is true, well then water should still be able to partially dissolve at least some of the postulated compounds or byproducts involved in a Maillard reaction. And this should have left detectable traces of residual evidence behind, which would have been detectable by STURP in their scientific instruments. So for example, such effects would be especially evident in the water-stained areas which intersect the body images. In the year 1532, there was a fire that affected the shroud and burned part of the shroud, and the Shroud of Turin was subsequently doused in water. And creating some water stains on the Shroud of Turin. Some of these water stains intersect the body images. Now, if the body images were produced through a Maillard reaction between the starch layer and the gases of Jesus' decaying body, or a corpse's decaying body, then it would be evident. Obviously this starch layer would be dissolvable in water, and that would leave some detectable traces behind for the STURP scientists to detect. However, the STURP scientists have shown that all such areas have been completely unaffected from the 1532 fire and subsequent water dousing regions, and or any of the other water stain areas on the Shroud of Turin. So we know from the 1532 fire and water dousing, the original STURP's confirmatory experiments by Drs. Heller and Adler is the correct result here. Quote unquote, the colored images are not water soluble, as would be expected if Rogers' hypothesis for the body image formation was true. Consequently, it seems unlikely that even these detected starch impurities, that's a scientifically proven fact, we cannot deny that on a balance of probabilities, but even these starch impurities detected on the Shroud didn't have anything to do with the formation of the body images through some kind of Maillard reaction. It's improbable that's the case. And instead, it's funny, the absence of the expected detectable water-soluble compounds from this associated with the starch layer under a Maillard reaction, the fact that this is not found actually counts against. This is a disproof of Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction. It's probably false, because we would expect to find these water-soluble compounds associated with the starch layer from a Maillard reaction if that happened, and yet we don't find that. Again, scientifically falsified, modus tollens type reasoning on a balance of probabilities at least. However, being consistent with our minimal relevant features approach, remember, counterfeatures, I don't use counterfeatures against an ordinary naturalistic or ordinary artistic theory. They're always just there to help the Shroud skeptics, and there's a lesser burden of proof. There's no scholarly consensus needed, and it just needs to be proven on a balance of probabilities to be true, which the starch impurities certainly qualifies under. Because of that, I assigned a questionable status to this counterfeature in terms of whether the Maillard reaction is proved by it or can be explained by it. Explain this. Obviously, the Maillard reaction would explain these starch impurities. It's problematic as to why, how to explain the water stain issue, but we're not going to count that against Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction, just as part of our thesis, right? No counterfeature can be used against a Shroud skeptic's theory. However, if forget about my methodology, my minimal relevant features methodology, where I kind of cheat for the Shroud skeptics, if you're just interested in genuine truth, look, this disproves Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction. It shows that it's probably false because of this finding about the water stains. So yeah, that's it on that front. So that covers it. That's it in terms of our minimal relevant features and assessing the gas evaporation or gas diffusion mechanisms. Let's go into our overall cumulative case considerations and conclusions and analyze the gas diffusion mechanisms in light of our best explanation inference criteria. Okay, so first, in terms of plausibility, the notion that a decomposing body would emit various gases and leave resultant staining on a linen cloth that's enveloped around it, well, that would seem highly plausible. I mean, that happens all the time, whether dead or not. Bodies produce sweat, and that stains linen. So that part is definitely plausible. And many people in history have been wrapped in burial shrouds and left to decompose in them over the course of millennia. So at the very first, at face value, there's high plausibility here. However, here's the part. On a practical level, unfortunately, there have been millions and millions of people throughout all of history who've been buried in linen cloths and left to decompose. And yet the Shroud of Turin is the only cloth with images like this in all of history. Think of all the linen-wrapped ancient Egyptian mummy wrappings or fragments or medical wounds or bandages or burial garments and shroud that scholars have been able to access and study and that sort of thing. None of these cloths have any images with similar features to what's found on the Shroud of Turin. Now, it has to be admitted, as my good friend Barry Schwartz mentioned, and my also good friend on the skeptic side, Hugh Ferry, has mentioned, we have to be honest here. A very small fraction of the number of burial shrouds in human history, or linen garments that wrapped a dead body where it was decomposing and gases came out and that sort of thing, we have but a fraction upon a fraction of a fraction. And this speaks to the idea in terms of natural opportunity for shroud images to be duplicated. Is it sufficient or not? Do we have a sufficient sample size of ancient linen garments wrapping a dead body to be able to say, well, look, the shroud is totally unique and that's an extraordinary, that's debatable. I don't think that we have as we'll find out when I get to Criterion B, this is an open question and people are skeptical. Has there been a sufficient sample size of ancient burial garments and burial shrouds that we have access to today to say, yes, indeed, the shroud is unique in terms of its images. No other burial shrouds ever got images like that. You know, the burial shroud of the Apostle Peter, the burial shroud of Julius Caesar, the burial shroud, well, Julius Caesar wouldn't work, but you get what I'm saying, right? Of all the peeps that had burial shrouds, do we have a large enough amount of surviving burial shrouds to go, yeah, only the shroud ever had images like these? And a lot of Barry Schwartz or Hugh Ferry, they would say no, we can't conclude that there's been a sufficient natural opportunity for duplication in a naturalistic context, not a religious figure like Jesus, but the burial shroud of John Smith walking around as a Jew or something like that back in the ancient days of Jesus. We don't have that. I'll save my assessment for that when we come to the overall conclusions of Criterion B. So remember, Criterion B, there's various ways to argue that the shroud images are extraordinary. There's the mechanistic arguments, and then there's also circumstantial arguments, and then there's also the uniqueness despite sufficient opportunity for duplication. And in terms of natural opportunities with all the burial shrouds, I'll just give it away now, but I don't think that we've had a sufficient opportunity, a sufficient amount of sample size to say that the Shroud of Turin is truly unique, based on natural opportunities at least. However, I do think that the uniqueness is still a fact out of all the millions of people, and this will play a part as a circumstantial argument when we get to it. The circumstances that only the shroud happened to have these miraculous images on it and of Jesus, and they survived, whereas not a single other shroud happened to survive with images. You know, the shroud of John Smith or the shroud of Hugh, the ancient ancestor of Hugh Ferry or something like that. Hugh Ferricus, I don't know. That circumstance, I think, is extraordinary in and of itself, but I'll get to that argument later on down the line. Right now we're just focusing on the uniqueness of opportunity and the mechanistic arguments, and yeah, that's kind of where I stand, but I'll get to that in more detail later on. Anyways, outside of natural opportunity, though, there's also been artificial opportunity, field and lab experiments, and there have been a lot of scientific experiments rigorously done to try and reproduce a copy of the shroud's minimal relevant features using gas diffusion methods. And these techniques have been utter failures. They come nowhere close in terms of duplicating all of the shroud's minimal relevant features, as we discussed with each one above. So yeah, the shroud's images remain unique despite ample opportunity to be duplicated within a ordinary naturalistic context. So I think even if you want to argue that the natural opportunity is insufficient, because just the way antiquity is, most of the burial shrouds and most of the linen garments covering dead bodies and stuff just hasn't survived to the modern day for us to properly compare and contrast to the shroud. Nonetheless, there has been sufficient, in my opinion, artificial opportunity testing the gas diffusion hypotheses at least, and that proves that, yeah, the gas diffusion doesn't work. It's unique. The shroud is in fact unique despite sufficient opportunity for duplication, and that sufficient opportunity specifically comes in the provable artificial variety, field and lab experiments that have been done to try and test that, as opposed to the natural opportunities, which is more questionable, let's say. All right, finally, so that's my practical take on the plausibility. It's implausible given the sufficient artificial opportunity for duplication, and yet the utter failure of all of the many scientific experiments done to test the gas diffusion models. Therefore, gas diffusion models are, practically speaking, implausible based on the artificial opportunities for duplication, and yet the Shroud remains unique in terms of its minimal relevant features. But beyond the practical considerations of plausibility, it's also gas diffusion models or mechanisms are also theoretically implausible because our background knowledge states that, look, it's implausible that a diffusive spreading, which spreads gases spread out in all directions equally, would be able to produce the Shroud's high resolutions, three-dimensional info, and vertically mapped wrapping distortions. All of the macro evidence available today is to the contrary on this front. All of our current scientific knowledge gained through experimentation, trial and error, knowledge, theoretical knowledge with this method has proven that gases or vapors will always diffuse in all directions equally. And that will not produce the images that we see with the Shroud Trin. You will get relatively formless blurs or blurry images and that sort of thing. So that's what our background knowledge has to say about this. Okay, what about assessing plausibility in terms of the two specific versions of the gas diffusion hypothesis, rather going beyond just the general implausibility of all gas diffusion mechanisms in general? There are some plausibility issues with each of the two specific gas diffusion hypotheses we looked at. In terms of the Vapograph Hypothesis, this Vapograph theory requires that a human body produce enough sweat to create the image-forming vapors. However, given our background knowledge of how the human body works, it's highly dubious that a human body could have produced a sufficient amount of sweat, and hence the resultant ammonia gas, in order to create the body images in the first place. I mean, medically speaking, there is a limit to how much moisture one can produce through sweating, right? So yeah, since the perspiration evaporates relatively quickly, it just seems very unlikely that the body would still have had a sufficient amount of sweat on it when it was finally wrapped up in the burial cloth and placed in the tomb, presumably. Then, so this problem only becomes even more acute when one postulates that the body may have been washed too, right? Either superficially or otherwise. A partial washing or a full washing would take away parts of the sweat. So this would have removed a lot of that, and it seems implausible on a balance of probabilities that the body would have had the proper sufficient amount of sweat on it for this Vapograph hypothesis to be true. Just to paraphrase Shroud expert Mark Antonacci on this, quote unquote, a living body, let alone a dead one, would probably not be able to secrete the required amount of fluids needed for this theory to account for the body images. And even if it is assumed that a body could produce a sufficient quantity of such fluids, it is even more unlikely that a body would still be covered in copious amounts of such sweat at the time the body was prepared for burial. So yeah, that's definitely very implausible for the Vapograph hypothesis here. What about with respect to Ray Rogers' Maillard reaction? Are there some specific Maillard reaction specific implausibilities here? Well, remember, Rogers proposed the Maillard reaction would not take place unless the body's temperature was approximately between 38 and 40 degrees Celsius or higher. So this is a specific aspect. The body temperature had to be 38 to 40 degrees Celsius or higher for it to work. But yet, by the time the body was wrapped in the shroud and placed in a tomb, it would be most unlikely that the body could have maintained this high of a temperature, right? It definitely would have cooled down as you took the body off the cross or brought the body into a tomb environment. Again, remember that cool tomb-like environment is necessary for the Maillard reaction to avoid the convection currents issue of the blurry images and that sort of thing. Convection currents highly disrupt the gases that are diffused from a decaying body. However, I will say I spoke about this with Barry Schwartz, and he said, based off Ray Rogers' argumentation, so Barry Schwartz, he himself admits that, yes, look, the body would have obviously cooled down considerably as it was brought to the tomb. However, Barry Schwartz says he denies that a temperature of 38 to 40 degrees is essential to encode the images through a Maillard reaction process. So according to Barry here, the same effect can be achieved at lower temperatures so long as a longer period of time is postulated with stationary gases, no convection currents moving the gases around. Well, then the images could still have been formed over a period of up to 36 hours before sufficient signs of decomposition liquids would begin to accumulate onto the cloth. And I think it works as a counter here, but I would just remind you that, or again, remember, the longer you're there, 36 hours or more, the longer the body's sitting in the Shroud of Turin, the more likely it is we would see image saturation and images being disrupted and that sort of thing because of the image saturation, at the very least around the bodily orifices, or the orifices of the body. So just, bear that in mind. Obviously, this point is debatable here in terms of the temperature, and it's dependent on the amount of time and the environment in which the corpse is wrapped in the shroud. Plus, we know that the shroud man would have been in severe dehydration, which is known to increase someone's internal body temperature for extended periods of time. So I think I'll say it's questionable at best as to whether the Maillard reactions is a plausible explanation given this amount of the body temperature that's required, and then the counters to that saying it doesn't have to be that high versus not. But just be aware that this is a factor that speaks to the plausibility of the theory in terms of the body temperature and the conditions in which the body was wrapped in the shroud. Okay, next, in terms of the explanatory scope criterion, how many facts or minimal relevant features are these gas diffusion theories able to account for? We saw in this part it's an utter failure to fulfill this criterion. All gas diffusion mechanisms inherently fail to explain the high resolution, three-dimensionality of the images and provide those vertically mapped wrapping distortions as encoded on the Shroud of Turin's body images. Additionally, as was noted above in some of the gas diffusion models, these gas diffusion models, none of them even attempt to explain the presence of the bloodstains and their many features at all. They don't even talk about how the bloodstains would interact with the mechanism of gas diffusion. Is it true that the presence of blood if that blood was on the shroud first, would that block the gas's ability to interact or create a chemical reaction? Or, it doesn't even interact with this, but it's usually presumed to work with a direct contact method in terms of explaining the blood stains. That's the typical position of those who would take a gas diffusion mechanism or hypothesis. So they have to use some kind of combination theory in order to account for both the body images and the bloodstain images. And finally, in terms of explanatory scope, look, most damning and devastating of all is that the head honcho himself, Dr. Ray Rogers himself, admits, look, his own theory and all gas diffusion theories will inevitably fall short of the mark in terms of explaining all the minimal relevant features, those physical and chemical attributes of the shroud images. But yet he claims that despite any shortcomings in his own experimental results on this front, he maintains that the entire point in his suggesting the Maillard Reaction Hypothesis was merely to quote-unquote recognize that blanket statements about gas diffusion and resolution can't be supported by simple assumptions alone. That's all he was trying to prove. He knew that the Maillard reaction was an utter failure in terms of being the sole explanation or explanatory mechanism for the shroud's body images. So obviously, great. We can concede Rogers' main point, not a problem about using blanket statements, but it nevertheless remains a fact that all gas diffusion models, including Ray Rogers, which is the best of them to date, they don't even come anywhere close to reproducing all of the shroud's physical and chemical attributes, or what we're calling these minimal relevant features. Therefore, it lacks explanatory scope by the admission of the proponents of these theories themselves. I just want to end on explanatory scope. Here's a quote from my good friend Dr. Gary Habermas, and he provides, in a personal correspondence to me, he gave a grim assessment of Rogers' theory as well. He says, quote unquote, "The Maillard reaction process requires bodily decomposition and putrefaction on the cloth, but there is none there. Gas diffusion is also required, but in many tests, diffusion is one of the worst proposed mechanisms. No distribution of sugar or starch on the cloth as required by the Maillard reaction. Only smudges would result. No three-dimensional, negatives, high resolution, or superficial imaging would result from them. Rogers himself only tried to simulate the easier-to-explain Shroud aspects and was not close to duplicating the more difficult Shroud images. Even if Barry is right, so I asked him a question here, so even as Barry is right, and the additional thesis could account for the high resolution, there are still way too many major aspects left unexplained. Basically, Gary's responding to, even if Barry's right about the additional thesis, so that isn't about the gas diffusion proper, it's about the gas diffusion plus, I was asking about an electrostatic mechanism working in conjunction with that. So that's what that last little bit is. That doesn't apply to us in the gas diffusion thing here. But yeah, so you get the point from Gary. Look, this is gas diffusion, at least by itself, utter failure. It's horrible. It doesn't do the job. And we saw why when we discussed the minimal relevant features above. So that leads into the explanatory power criterion. How well does this hypothesis account for the facts? It's a qualitative factor. And as we saw, all gas theories utterly fail to fulfill the explanatory power criterion. They lack the power to account for high resolution images, three-dimensional dimensionality, can't account for the vertically mapped wrapping distortions, has issues with image saturation, and in some cases superficiality. It's ambiguous. There's a high degree of ambiguity on several of these features where it's questionable as to whether they'd be able to account for them or not. Questionable as to whether gas diffusion mechanisms would operate uniformly over differing substances, including human hair, and skin. Really, they'd be equally sweaty? I don't know about that. And then, positing the precise amount of gas or vapor necessary to produce the properties through diffusive spreading alone, while at the same time leaving no detectable residual traces of decomposition. This just strains credulity to the maximum. It just, I'm sorry, no, it's very, very improbable. In fact, I would even argue scientifically impossible to account for all of the minimal relevant features. One last point on explanatory power, and this is specific to the vapograph theory. Another reason it's scientifically impossible for the vapograph method, again, operating on its own merits, to explain the superficiality of the body images, because the ammonia vapors are lighter than air gas, and they would inevitably penetrate the threads of the cloth and thus produce staining throughout the entirety of the cloth. And this is what Paul Vignon himself observed in his own scientific experiments back in the 1930s. This is the result that he got with his method as well. So a total failure for the gas diffusion methods. Okay, finally, our last criterion is the less ad hoc, or the scientific criterion of simplicity. How many ad hoc components does it imply here? Well, in general, gas diffusion theories are ad hoc in that they assume all the decomposition and biochemical traces needed to create the stain, the chemical reaction that stains the cloth and thereby creates the yellow body images. All of that is just completely oxidized over time. No residual traces at all, despite spectrographic microphotographs, chemical analysis on various dozens and dozens of tests. I don't believe that. That's too ad hoc. That's improbable. And also supposing that a gas could diffuse in a way that has never been observed in history. Gases disperse in all directions equally, but yet gas diffusion hypotheses, in this case it just went vertically. It created vertically encodation paths somehow, when that's totally against our experience of gases. I don't believe that. Additionally, with Rogers' Maillard reaction in particular, it's even more ad hoc in postulating, one, that the body would have been removed in sufficient time to prevent sufficient amounts of decomposition liquids from accumulating on the shroud. Two, that the presence of spice packs and flowers positioned perfectly to avoid forming body side images at all, not even little partial mistaking bits or that sort of thing. That's ad hoc. And finally, three, postulating that the proven detection of starch impurities on the surface of linen fibers on the shroud, using his microchemical tests, and that necessarily implies that the shroud had a pervasive microthin layer of starch along its entire surface. That's very ad hoc. The scientific data doesn't say that. So I would say that these theories fail the less ad hoc criterion as well. So yeah, that's in a nutshell. I think that gas diffusion theories, diffusion hypotheses or mechanisms are very improbable, and I would even argue scientifically impossible to, whether you think that's 100%, I think it is, or you want to say 99.99% proven that they're false. Either way, I'm happy. It doesn't matter. The point is, yeah, these don't work. They're utter failures. So yeah, that's it in terms of the gas diffusion mechanisms. All right, so next time continuing on in our Shroud solo series, part 15, because this is part 14, next time we will cover the another ordinary naturalistic hypothesis, again, kind of involving direct contact and gas diffusion to some extent in combination, but it's going to be called the Volcringer patterns hypothesis. So this was a theory based on Dr. John Volcringer in the 1940s and John A. DeSalvo in the 1980s, early 1980s. So we'll be going over the Volcringer patterns hypothesis. And if, depending on how much is in there, I might include another hypothesis or mechanism known as the Russell effect. But if not, if I have enough, then I'll separate that out for part 16 or whatever. At the very least, we'll definitely be looking at the Volcringer patterns hypothesis or mechanism next time for our show. So look forward to that, and have a great week, everybody.